The following interview is being conducted with Dr. Sarah Mata for the Latino Americans 500 Years of History Grant Project at Oklahoma State University. The interview will become part of the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program at the Edmond Lowe Library on the Stillwater campus of Oklahoma State University. The interview is taking place on Saturday, June 18th, 2016, in Dr. Mata's home in Norman, Oklahoma. The interviewer is Victor Domingos Baeza, Director of Library Graduate Services. Thank you for agreeing to participate in this oral history project, Dr. Mata. I want to remind you that this may be published as part of the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater, Oklahoma, and that you have granted us permission to publish the transcript and video in part or in its entirety. Okay, so to start off the interview, can you please, again, I've already asked you, but can you tell me your name again?
Sarah Mata.
And where were you born?
I was born in Phoenix, Arizona, actually.
And how long did you live there?
Probably I was less than a year old. So my mother's family is originally from Kansas, so she moved back to Kansas.
Where in Kansas?
Kansas City, Kansas.
And do me a favor, and can you tell me something about your parents?
So, my parents were married and my dad was in the military, which was why we were in Phoenix, Arizona, although I have a great deal of paternal side of my family that lives in Phoenix. But my parents separated and divorced when I was 2, so I really didn't grow up much with my father. It was just mostly my mother and her side of the family that were part of my childhood and upbringing.
Is that why you moved to Ark City?
Yes, it is. But my family, my grandparents, my mother was originally from there and had a long history of living in Kansas, actually. And so when they separated, my mother moved back with her family.
So tell me about your mother.
My mother. She is still living. I have a great deal of responsibility of filling and take care of her still. She's 71 currently. My mother worked at a hospital for a majority of her career doing data entry, which kind of is almost doesn't really exist anymore. She spent probably a good 15-20 years working at the hospital before she retired, and has been retired for quite some time now, and is doing well.
And do you have any siblings?
I do. I have 2 brothers. I have an older brother who's 5 years older, and I have a younger brother who is 17 months younger than I am.
And so were they all with you in Ark City?
Yes, but my older brother left when he was about 17 and went to California, which at that time was where my paternal side, my grandmother, my dad was, and so he went to live with him. And so I was really young, so I was getting into my teenage years, so I remember him, but he really wasn't around a lot. My younger brother, obviously don't know what living was like without him because we were so close in age. But yeah, we grew up together.
So what was it like growing up in Ark City?
It's a small town. I don't know that I appreciated it as much. I think now as an adult, looking back and understanding the history of why my family was there and how unique that was, I have a more of a appreciation for it, and thankful that I had that experience. But at the time, I was young and naive and very much sheltered in a lot of ways that I think small towns are notorious for doing. So I go back pretty often. My family, my mother is still there. My younger brother lives there. So, and all of my aunts and uncles are there as well. So
So what is your family history in Arc City?
So my great-grandfather was recruited by the Santa Fe Railroad. Lived in Mexico at the time, and so they were brought to the United States to work with the railroad. And in Arc City was one of the places where the Santa Fe Railroad built a community, actually. And so my entire maternal side of both my grandmother and my grandfather's brothers and sisters and even their parents lived within a square mile of each other. And so I thought that was normal. It wasn't until grad school when I was doing a exercise for a multicultural class that I realized that not everybody grows up with their great aunts and uncles living across the street, or their grandparents. My grandparents lived directly across the street from me my entire life growing up. And so that was amazing for me, because they were like, the whole community was kind of like sets of parents that looked after you. And growing up around my cousins, and we ruled that neighborhood. And it was so close to the railroad tracks that I have such a connection to trains and the railroad because of that, that I actually like where I live currently. I can hear them at night, and it reminds me of growing up.
So do you know what year it was that they brought your family up?
So my great-grandmother was actually interviewed for the newspaper at one time, and she tells a story about remembering the seeing bodies, and that was the Mexican War at that time. So I think when we did the research, it was like in 1889 or 1890s that they originally came to the United States. And my great-grandmother tells the story of paying 5 cents to come to the United States, and they were considered citizens at that point in time. How immigration has changed. And so I think I'm like 5th generation, because that was initially when they came in. It was at least 115 years ago. So it's crazy to think about.
So at the time, when you were growing up in Arc City, is there a large Hispanic community there?
No, not at all. If you were brown, you were probably related in some way or fashion. So there was not. And I tell this story often when I talk about my upbringing, but I never really felt like that was different. My mother and her siblings would often talk about racism, and but it was more because the nuns would not, in the Catholic school, obviously, but they were not allowed to speak the language at all, and they had to assimilate very quickly. And so my grandparents actually did not want their children to speak Spanish because they wanted everybody to be alike. And so my mother would tell stories about how the nuns were very mean and would treat them different, but I never really felt like I was different when it came to race. I did, however, feel like I was different because my parents were divorced and I was in Catholic school, and that was such a taboo thing back in the day. But there were not, and I always, even going to Walmart or to the grocery and I see the Hispanic food aisle, I mean, getting tortillas anywhere that wasn't from your family's house was not even heard of. And my grandparents had to travel to get any of the ingredients that you can see now to see at the convenience store. So it has changed quite a bit since growing up.
And so during your teen years, you never felt any kind of racism or any kind of that you were being treated differently?
No, not because of race. I think, and again, I am self-disclosed, I was very naive and maybe didn't recognize those things, because now when I talk to people who I went to school with and they would talk about situations that happened, I never knew that race was an issue behind it, or why they wouldn't hang out with somebody, or why now someone might not be invited because they're from a particular race. But I never felt like that was an issue. The only time the first time I remember having an encounter, which, because my family had a Mexican restaurant back home growing up, and I worked there starting when I was 13 years old. And I remember there was a regular who came in and was quite intoxicated or had been drinking, and he came in and I was seating him and I had the menus, and he just walked in and I was putting the menus on the table, and he made a comment, and I turned to him, he's like, "Oh, you probably don't even understand what I'm saying." He's like, and started speaking fake Spanish to try to make himself think that he was speaking my language. And I didn't understand it then, but I now know that was one of the first experiences where I did not like how he made me feel, his response and how he treated me, and how he was definitely making a comment because of my race at that time.
So as I introduced you as Dr. Sarah Mata, you obviously have gone through a lot of education.
Yes.
Was education a priority when you were growing up?
No. It wasn't a priority that felt like was important for me to pursue. My mother, obviously, I remember one of the struggles of my older brother was he didn't like school. And I was probably 12, 13, and he was 18, trying to finish high school. And I remember my mother always angry with him because he did not want to get up to go to school. He just hated school. And but I remember how much stress that caused my mother. She wanted him to be in school. And so that I can remember was important, that I needed to finish high school, but never remember having a conversation about college or aspirations of making something of myself. That never really came up.
Were you the first in your generation to get a college degree? Or in your family?
Yes. My mother did, after she came back, and she did go and do some college courses at the community college, and I think she might have even graduated with her associate's degree. But I didn't know that. I didn't know that that's what she was doing. It wasn't that she was a model for me to be able to go and do that. But definitely I'm the first in my family to get a bachelor's degree, let alone a PhD.
So what was your path to college?
So my path to college, when I was in high school, as a senior, I really liked art, and art seems to be something in my family. My uncle's a very good artist. My mother even likes to do art, and she would do a lot more when we were younger. So it just came natural for me. And I remember my high school teacher had submitted one of my art. It was a big picture, and it was of a girl in a T-bird, and she's looking over her shoulder, and I titled it "So My Daddy Takes the T-Bird Away," based on the song. But it was more that I was living vicariously through this young woman who was driving this car and was just being so carefree. And it was one of my favorites. And she had submitted into an art show, and from the art show I won a scholarship to the community college, and I had no idea what that meant. I had no idea what community college was. I had no idea what I was supposed to even do with it. But I knew that if somebody gives you something, you thank them and you take advantage of it. So, and plus I didn't know what I was going to do. So I had some great art instructors at the community college, and really helped me to think I knew what I wanted to do. And because they were so convincing, that I went to the community college and I finished. And I majored in computer graphic design, which at the time was very beginning, computers. I remember now looking back, these huge big Mac chunks on the table. But it was something really new doing that on the computer. And I worked for about 5 years doing that, and it was not what I anticipated. Kind of killed my creativity. When you're doing things for other people, you kind of start doing it with their thoughts of what they think is creative, and I lost my own, I feel like my own creativity in that process. And it's such a, turnaround, fast-paced kind of experience that I didn't really like it as much. And my first adult job, when I finished high school, I worked, because I've always worked. I've worked to help support my family. Like I mentioned, I started when I was 13. Was that I worked in a hospital. My mother worked in the hospital, and so I had started a position at the hospital too. And I was the referral clinic coordinator, I believe was my title. And what I was doing was being cross-trained for all these different things within the business office. But I also worked in the emergency room registration and in admissions, and even worked in an oncology clinic, which all these dynamics of seeing how I was helping and working with people really told me that's what I wanted to do in some aspect. And so when I finished, I moved to Stillwater. And when I moved to Stillwater, I met a couple, and they said, well, why don't you go back for your bachelor's degree? And that doesn't sound fun, but okay. It was a lull time in my life, and I knew I needed to do something different. Otherwise, I was going to be getting paid minimum wage, and that wasn't something I was excited about, because I knew that meant you kind of struggle a little bit. So I went back and got my bachelor's degree in juvenile corrections and treatment because I wanted to help, and I like young people. I like working with adolescents because I wanted to be somebody that I had wanted for me as an adolescent, going through the teenage years and helping to make better decisions as a teenager. And so I finished that degree, and then I started working with adolescents who were in the juvenile system. Was a lot. It was heavy, it was hard, and it was literally heartbreaking in the sense that what you were going into was so helpless and hopeless in a lot of ways, and I didn't like that feeling, because it was very evident, and still is now, that there was a pipeline from the detention centers to the prisons, and the way we handle working with our juveniles just doesn't work. And so I thought, I'll do counseling. That sounds better. I'm going to help them before they make those bad decisions. And so I did a community counseling master's degree, and then did counseling for a while. And I knew I was going to probably need to get a counselors make awful money here. It's not much different than minimum wage. So I thought, well, I'll probably just get my PhD, because that's what you do as you continue to move up, right? And the reason my aspirations for getting a PhD was I wanted to be in those positions to help make policy change and make decisions that are going to be more long-term. It's not, I can sit and talk to you one-on-one and help you with all your problems, but that doesn't change systemically. And so that's why I went into a PhD program in sociology, and wanted to focus on adolescents, particularly the Native American community, which is where I had been working. But at the time, I didn't do a very good job of researching faculty's interest. Although I had got my bachelor's degree in that program, but then when I came to the PhD, where you really needed somebody who was interested in the things that you were interested in, there really weren't faculty members doing that. And so I changed and completed my master's in sociology, and instead of finishing the PhD, because it was a lot of theoretical perspective and old white guys who came up with those theories, and that just didn't seem to fit. I wanted to be more applied sociology, and so finished my master's. I got accepted into the Social Foundations program in the College of Education, and the coursework and the things that we were researching and studying was right where I wanted to be, right where I felt like that's what it is. That's what I want to be doing. I want to be critical of the educational system. I knew that education is the vehicle for young people and for families to get out of poverty. But how do we make that more accessible? How do we help students from underrepresented populations be successful at the college level if they're coming from situations before that are not adequately preparing them? And so that is how I finished my PhD in that program. It's so wrong.
Now, if I can take you back, do you remember what year it was that you moved from Ark City to Stillwater?
Yes, it was 99.
And why did you make that move?
At the time I was married, and my son was just born, and I remember it in 99 because the month I moved was the month after the huge 99 tornado, and I remember being really scared. But I had just had my son, and my his dad at the time, my husband, ex-husband, had started a business there in Stillwater, and so there was a fallout with the business partner, and that left a lot of things uncertain, and I didn't like feeling like that. So, and I had the associate's degree already, and so some friends had said, you should go back.
So what was that process for you of applying to OSU and getting in?
Well, the friends that I had met who said you should go back, both worked they were a couple and they were married, both worked at the university, and so they had colleagues, they had friends, they were able to say, you need to go talk to this person here and this person there. Otherwise, I'm not sure how well it would have been. I know at that time, coming in as a transfer student, the ideas of that working effectively were not in place. And it was really hard. I mean, I was moving an hour away from my hometown, away from my family, and that was so hard initially. It's just an hour, but it was really hard. And coming from a town that had maybe 13,000 people to a city and a university that had like twice that, that also was a little overwhelming initially. I was glad though, coming in with my associates, that I didn't have to be in those 200, 300 student classrooms, but and I was more ready to be in some of my core courses, which were much smaller courses. So I'm grateful for that, because I don't know how I would have done. I think my largest class probably was 150, and that was a nutrition class, and I was thankful for the labs to kind of make that a little bit more intimate. But it was a process, and I'm thankful for that couple who were able to help handhold and get me through the process, because it was really intimidating.
Do you remember their names?
Yes, Jim and Deborah Hull. And Deborah works in the library, and her husband at the time I think was working in microbiology. But they were students. Jim was a student in my son's dad's academy. He was doing martial arts at the time and had an academy there, and so that's how we met them.
And when you applied, or when you went through the registration process, at any time, or what were you thinking as far as how you were going to pay for it? That's a good question. I knew that I had 2 children at the time, so my daughter was 5 and my son was 6 months old, and I knew that I probably would qualify for financial aid, and so that was going to be a benefit to be able to help pay for school.
But then again, I knew I was going to work, and I was told about work studies, so I did that the entire time I was going to school. But I never, because when I talk to students now, I mean, that's one of their big questions, like, oh, I can't go to school, I can't afford that. I don't remember ever thinking that was one of the big questions. Now, and now, you look at my student loans, I probably could have been more proactive in asking that question, but I don't remember ever that being a deterrent or feeling like that was something that was keeping me from considering going to school. I just remember it being more intimidating because it was a university, and it was much bigger than what I had been used to.
So where did you do your work study?
I did my work study at the Stillwater Police Department. I was just telling the story the other day because I worked for records department there at the police department, and they had just moved into a new building, so they were changing from all of their old records to wasn't even digital at the time, but I hated it. It was awful because I sat at this, it sounds fancy, I work for the police department, worked in the records, and you're like thinking, ooh, most people would be thinking, ooh, what kind of things did you see? No, I sat at a machine that's called microfishing, where I just sat and fed this machine full of like index cards of people who'd been arrested, and so it was not as fun as I anticipated it to be, but it opened up a lot of doors for me because I did get exposed to law enforcement, and because of my position working in that role, I was able to then actually be asked to do part-time work and work in the jail, because as I mentioned, they just moved into a new building, and there was some misunderstandings about how the jail was going to work, and so they needed somebody to work in kind of behind the switchboard, which is open and closes the doors, and was kind of like the eye in the system to be able to, and take calls and that type of thing. So I'm glad I stuck it out. It's just initially it was not okay.
So what year did you start the program at OSU, and what year did you earn your degree?
Which degree?
The bachelor's.
Okay, so I started in 2000, and I started working. I was working at the psychological services too, at the OSU psychological services, and then when my classes started to conflict too much with my degree plan, then I quit. So I was, again, I've always worked while I was going to school. So I started in 2000, and then I finished my bachelor's degree in 2003, and then master's in 2005, master's in 2007, and then PhD I finished in 2014.
So what was the driving force? You kind of mentioned this earlier, but what was the driving force, or what point in your bachelor's degree did you say, I need to go get a master's?
So my initial degree for my bachelor's was in art. So I started because that was my associate's degree. But as I mentioned, I was doing computer graphic design. At the time when I was coming into OSU, their graphic design was still sitting there, drawing and typography where you like actually draw each letter. And so it was a little bit of a step back for me, but it was more of an emphasis on the fine art piece of graphic design. And so that is when I changed to a juvenile corrections and treatment and sociology degree. And I don't think I thought about a master's until till I already graduated. So I think it was during the summer that I actually figured out that I wanted to do a master's degree. When I was doing counseling and I started talking to or working with adolescents, and then I started talking to some of the counselors, and they said, well, you need to get your LPC, which is your licensed professional counselor, and you need to get your master's. And so I think it was then that I pursued my master's.
So when you first started going to OSU, did you, at any point, did you start looking for other Hispanic students?
I did probably more towards the end of my graduate program, or my undergrad. So, because I remember getting the emails at some point in time, and there was a call for tutors. And so at that, and because I was a non-traditional student, you know, I wasn't on campus other than just there for my classes. I didn't ever know that there was a multicultural office. I didn't know that there was a Hispanic student coordinator or any of that. But when I got the email about requesting for a tutor and asking people to volunteer, I took advantage of that. So that's how I got even somewhat involved with the Hispanic Student Association.
So that's who sent out the request?
Yes. And so I tutored, she was in high school, and I still keep in contact with her. She's now married and has 2 little boys. And, you know, that was pretty cool.
So at that time, how could you tell me, what do you think the size of the Hispanic Student Association was?
Very slim, non-existent. I think even just doing some research and going back to see how many Hispanic students were even at the institution when I was there, obviously it was very, very small. But it's hard for me to gauge if there was a strong community at the institution, because I never was a part of that. I never got involved in any organizations or did things outside of my program.
And do you remember who it was that hired you?
To
be a tutor?
I don't. And I might have also had connections because Dahlia was in the sociology. I think she was my advisor, and she was also involved in the Hispanic Student Association at the time. And I'm slipping on her last name, but as far as I know, she's still there, but she's been there for a really long time.
She was staff?
Yes. She was one of the sociology advisors.
What was her name again?
Dahlia.
And so when you decided to go back to OSU for your master's, did you then, now that you knew about the Hispanic Student Association, did you get involved with them at all?
No. And I think I had other Hispanic graduate students that I became friends with, and that were kind of in the same boat that I was, in the sense that you always felt different because you were a grad student, and it wasn't that the programming was geared towards that particular population. It was very much for the undergrad. So it was kind of hard to be able to, oh, now I want to be a part of this organization, even though you're like, well, they were much younger than me, but you know, there's a big difference between graduate students and undergraduate students.
So when you earned your master's degree, did you go straight into the PhD program, or did you work somewhere for a while? So
I've gone back to back. As I mentioned, I finished my first master's in 2005, and then, which was 60-hour master's program, which is insane. You think about that's a PhD hour program, but because you were supposed to be preparing for the LPC, which is an accreditation for being a counselor, that's why it was so hefty on the hours. I worked throughout that master's doing counseling, but then went and started my PhD, and that was when I started working at Oklahoma State in diversity. So I was doing that program while I was working at the university.
So which came first? You started the PhD program at OSU, or you got the job at OSU?
I started the PhD, but that was in sociology, where I ended up just getting a master's in that program, and that was in 07 or 07. Yes, so I finished that. I actually I started in 07 at Oklahoma State in diversity, and that was actually the year I was already a year into the PhD program, now that I think about it. So but I finished in 05 and then went straight into that PhD program. But finished my master's in 07, and I started at the university in 07.
And so, if I understand correctly, you were intending to get a PhD in that program, but stopped at the master's level, and then switched to a different program for your PhD?
Yes.
And that was when you started working for OSU?
I was, so 07 was, I graduated in December of 07 with my master's. That was initially supposed to be my PhD program. And then in 08 is when I started my PhD in the Social Foundations program.
And so what was your job when you started working for OSU?
So I was the Inclusion Leadership Program Coordinator, and that was in institutional diversity. It was one of the first 1 or 2 second year of the program, but I was responsible for working with second year college students, as well as the program was in high schools. So we had high schools in Tulsa and had high schools in Oklahoma City and in Stillwater. And it was a mentorship program, but also used as a recruiting tool, because if the students completed the program successfully, they got $1,000 towards coming to the university. And it was primarily targeting students from underrepresented high schools and underrepresented populations there.
And who hired you for that position?
Dr. Cornell Thomas.
What was that name again?
Cornell Thomas, who was one of my favorite people of all times, and still consider him a mentor. It's funny how we actually met. I was, I wasn't involved in student organizations, but because I was at the graduate college all the time with different things, paperwork or whatever. There was a coordinator at the time. His name was Mike Hepler, and he was very instrumental in getting. He even helped with my, thesis / creative component. He was very intentional about contributing to my experience and my education there at OSU. And he had invited me to come to a McNair research symposium at OSU, and I was sitting at a table, and I just happened to be sitting next to and initially met Dr. Thomas there. And I wasn't even thinking about anything. I was just telling him about what I do. I was counseling at the time, telling him about why I thought it was important, where I was counseling, which was in all over north central Oklahoma. So I was driving to all these little towns and helping kids who've been in trouble with the law, or families who'd had their kids taken away, doing parenting classes. I was doing all of these things, and I was pretty passionate about it, but it got kind of heavy at times. And so I just happened to be sharing all this information, and it wasn't until a couple weeks later he contacted me and he said, I have this position and I think you'd be great for it, like for you to apply. And I did. And he was he's such an amazing individual, but what made him so important to me and so essential to me now is I think he saw things in me that I didn't even know. I had no idea I was even going to go down the path that I was going to go down, but he knew, and he would always, he was notorious for always saying, I hired you, you do what you think is right. And I'm like, but wait, I need you to tell me. And he was never one of those people to be like, you do this, this, and this. And I learned so much from that freedom because he provided the structure, the vision, and the tools, but it was because of that I found where I feel like I needed to be. And because of that, I mean, that program and that work that I was doing with the Inclusion Leadership Program has totally changed my life. I've met so many amazing students and still keep in contact with them, even on a very, very often, even weekly sometimes with some of the students that I met. And that means a lot to me because it helps to validate what I felt was so important about that work, and what Dr. Thomas would say, you are their family while they're here. And we were, and that's pretty cool because we made them our family.
So you were working with underrepresented populations.
Yes.
Did you run into a lot of Hispanics doing that?
Yes, I did. And so one of my favorite things that I did while I was at OSU was a program called STYLE, which stands for Strengthening Today's Young Leaders Through Education. And we targeted high school girls who were who had never really considered going to the university before, in either the very rural areas or very urban areas. We wanted to get a lot of the participants from those areas. And one of the things that I learned while I was doing that was understanding the plight of students who were undocumented, because we had a large population of Latinas coming to the program. And it wasn't until after a financial aid presentation did we learn that about 7 or 8 of the 16 girls that were there were undocumented. And it was like a kick in the stomach. I remember feeling like, oh my God, what did we just do? We're just planning this unrealistic dreams for these girls to be here on this campus, and we can't even, the odds of them being able to afford it are just, and this was way before DACA or any of those, anything that related to potential DREAM Act, any of that, they were really without any possibilities. And so because of that, I mean, started getting really involved in working with the Hispanic students and the Hispanic population, not just at the university, but also in the communities and some of the advocacy groups, because I had no idea. I had no idea. I was immigration, like I mentioned, my grandparents, my great-grandparents paid 5 cents to go to the United States. And so it wasn't anything that I really had to deal with. I never had to go through any of that process.
So because you didn't have that experience, or you didn't share a lot of experiences that they had when you were growing up and going to college, what were some of the things that, I mean, you already mentioned the undocumented, but what were some of the other things that really surprised you about working with these Hispanic students?
I think it really made me more aware of privilege, and I know we were not well off and we were poor growing up, but I never saw poverty like I did when I was working with a lot of the Hispanic students and understanding what they were trying to deal with. And because a lot of them were first generation, some of their struggles as far as, you know, the girls' dads didn't want them to come to the university. They didn't trust us at the university. They were expected to get married and have kids, and that was normal. That I never understood that. I didn't know that was what a traditional kind of mentality they were coming from was never anything that I'd really been exposed to before. So there, it wasn't like you could say, well, good, just tell them this is going to be okay. Just tell them you're getting an education. Well, that's not, I had to really learn a lot about, they didn't want them to come to university because it's scary. There's a lot, even an hour difference to coming from the city to OSU, which is in the middle of nowhere, really, right? And you can't blame them, but that wasn't, I definitely wasn't as far from that as some people. Some people I was working with, well, they just need to tell their parents they're going to college, and that was supposed to be an appropriate response to helping these young people be able to know how to maneuver wanting to go to the university. There was the cultural competency that of a lot of people at the institution when I was working there needed a lot of help. And so I learned a lot about working with families who were coming first generation. And I actually did a lot of research when I was in my master's program. And I remember, I'll never forget this. I remember interviewing a little girl. She was undocumented, and she told me her story. She was 10 at the time, and she told me her story about how she came to the United States. And remembered every detail, and I just thought, God, this is symptoms of PTSD from having to go through this experience. But one of the things that I remember so vividly is she was saying, I worry every day when I go to school because I could go home and my parents couldn't be there. They might not be there because there was nothing stopping. And at that time it was where in Tulsa they just changed all of their officers to be ICE enforcers, right? So they could be immigration, as well as just pulling you over, and it was no big deal for them to just pack you up and put you in a vehicle and send you off. And so this little girl understood those dynamics at 10 and worrying every single day that she was going to come home and not have her parents. Those were things that working with first generation Hispanic students really taught me, because I didn't have any of those understanding prior to that experience.
So what you were saying, that the police were being trained to be immigration sort of, why was that being done?
It was that was a hot topic at the time. Immigration was a big deal, and that's when they were doing a lot of the crackdowns on people who are here that unlawful. And it's political. It wasn't necessarily that there was this huge influx of crime or anything like that. They were going to even schools who had like programs, and their parents were coming to see their kids. They were, doing raids there. They were doing raids at people's their employment. It was just becoming quite a fad at that point in time.
So, as this was going on, and you were working with an institutional diversity on the campus of OSU in Stillwater, did you then start getting more involved with like the Hispanic Student Association?
Yes. I probably got more involved with the Hispanic faculty and staff. So that was where I found more of a role, but I still helped a lot with the students and became engaged with their activities and their events. But one of the things that I was really passionate about when I was as the president of the Hispanic Faculty and staff, which I don't even remember what year that was to develop a scholarship program for the students. Because I knew, because of the work that I was doing with working with students who were undocumented, they need all the financial support that they can get when they come to the institutions, and that we as Hispanic faculty and staff need to be promoting as much as possible for developing scholarships and being able to support those students, because we know it's not, you can get the money to get here to the institution, but how are you helping them out to persist, right? And so that was more of how I felt like I got involved with the Hispanic community at OSU, was more with the Hispanic faculty and staff.
So what, you mentioned that when you started school there weren't very many Hispanic students, because you had looked that up, but how about Hispanic faculty and staff?
Oh no. I think there was a solid core, maybe 10, 12. And I think when I was the Hispanic faculty and staff president, I think we did the research and maybe there were 20 plus, but that was via Tulsa, Stillwater, OKC. That was not just in the Stillwater campus, and so there were not a lot.
Do you remember how many were actually faculty and how many were staff?
I think maybe there were 10 or 12 that were faculty, and I think there might have been. It was less than 20 for sure that were faculty, and the rest were staff. And again, not everybody participated. Just because they checked the box doesn't necessarily mean they want to get involved in power to the people kind of thing. So yeah, it was very few of us. I think we rotated. Everybody had their turn who was president while I was there.
So you were working for OSU as you were working on your PhD, and what was the degree again?
The PhD was in social foundations.
And had you thought about, I mean, in general, if you look at the statistics or you get those releases from the Pew Center, at any point did you think about the statistics about how many Hispanics get a bachelor's, how many get a master's, and how many, I mean, few students in general, when you look at the entire population of college students, ever go on to get a PhD. Did you ever look at the statistics as far as the Hispanics go?
Yeah, I know that I'm less than 1% have a PhD in any field. So as I started working at the university, I got involved in NASPA, which is the National Association of Student Personnel Administrators, and that primarily is working in student affairs, people who work in student affairs across the board throughout the institutions. And the piece that I really found a home was with the Latino knowledge community, and so that is where Latinos who are working in student affairs and working in higher ed in general have a membership and contribute. And so that was something that has been from the beginning so important to the work that we do on that level, to how are we promoting more Latinos into higher ed and to graduating, to continue to graduate degrees. So how are we supporting them in student affairs, programming and residential life, and scholarship, multicultural offices, and then also how are we promoting our own to be in more positions of VP of student affairs, deans, provosts, those kind of positions, and so and faculty. So we have a whole support system, but also encourage. Our whole purpose is to encourage more.
So, what year again did you finish your PhD?
2014.
Or earn your PhD, I guess you say. What year was that again?
2014.
And were you still working at OSU at the time?
Yes. No. I left in 2013. So I worked in institutional diversity until 2010. And then in 2010, I started another position in working in nutritional sciences, where I was working with a grant where we were working in with one of the Native American tribes here in Oklahoma and doing nutrition-based education, and primarily through in those serving areas with the tribal community, but also focusing on an educational program for first or third graders to preventing diabetes and health and wellness. So I did that until I guess it was 2014 when I left OSU and I took a position and went to Nebraska. I was in Nebraska when I finished my PhD.
So you were ABD when you left?
Yes.
And what was your dissertation?
My dissertation was looking at female faculty members who were diagnosed with breast cancer during their tenure and how that had an impact both on professionally as well as personally in maneuvering the system of higher education.
And so what is it that you're doing now? Are you still in Nebraska?
I am not in Nebraska. I am currently at the University of Oklahoma in Norman. Good folks. I am doing, working with another grant with the National Science Foundation, so it's an NSF grant. It's a multi-million-dollar grant looking at being a model for graduate education and primarily focusing on interdisciplinary research for graduate students. So I'm working with meteorology, geography, computer science, anthropology, communication, biology, and I think I might be missing one, but and putting together this graduate certificate to helping graduate students to understand that we're not going to solve the world's problems with just biology or just geography, so we have to figure out how we're talking to each other. And it's also focused on a program or a field called aeroecology, which is basically the study of all things in the aerosphere, from the ground up to a certain point in the air, that might have climate, environmental factors, or how they're being impacted, such as wind turbines and communication towers, and how is that impacting migration patterns for birds, or light pollution, all of these different things that have to do with things that fly or things that are in the air.
So since you earned your PhD, either prior to or after, did you ever have an experience where the fact that you were Hispanic came up?
Outside the institution or in the institution?
Either. Has it been a detriment or a plus in any way?
I had a situation, and I guess it's because it's the most recent situation. I don't know. Because the position that I work in is the National Science Foundation, they're very active in wanting to diversify graduate student programs, and so that's kind of like my work in diversity. Hopefully is a piece to wanting to contribute in that sense to make sure that we are also diversifying our programs there at OU. And I had a situation where someone had commented and said, "Oh, like, you're a minority?" And I mean, it was shocking to me because I've never had anybody question that before. But it almost alluded to the fact that because I am a minority, that's why I was in my position. And that was a little troubling because, you know, I feel like I earned where I'm at because of the work and the experience that I bring to the table, not because I'm checking off a box. So, but I think that's always going to be a question regardless of where I'm at or where, you know, any Latinos in higher ed are, you know, because it's not uncommon for us to have that question and to think that we're just filling the slot because it looks good for wherever.
Do you think it would have been any different had you been a Hispanic male?
That probably wouldn't have been asked. I don't know. I can't say.
So, of your experiences from the time you got to OSU, going through all your degrees, the different positions you've held in different institutions, what's the most beneficial experience you think you've had?
I would probably say they each have a contributing factor to why I think I am who I am today, but definitely the Inclusion Leadership Program, because I found myself in my career. I found what was going to be where I would base the rest of my, work that I wanted to do because of the students that I worked with. They changed my life, and they continue to. I had one of the students who was in my style program who and I know there's no question that the work that we did with style changed these young girls' lives. And she finished her degree in mechanical engineering last year, I want to say, or maybe it was last year, and she just got married, or she just got engaged last night. And so I just, seeing that, how these girls are in high school to transform to where they are now and being successful and doing what they, going through the university, and how that was a great recruiting tool because we were able to get them there. But then seeing that it made some real influence on their lives.
And so that was sort of what you gained from your education and your work experience. What would you consider to be the most meaningful or important event in your life?
I would have to say getting my PhD, probably, because of, I don't know, because I know it sets an example for others in my family. I know it sets an example for my family, in the sense that they contributed, right? Like, I don't sit here representing just myself. I represent all of them who were part of the process and helped me in a lot of ways to be able to getting to classes and having, the experience of, calling on them if I needed, childcare or whatever. But the PhD also serves an example for the students that I worked with and for my colleagues who are struggling with the program now. We're struggling to get a PhD because it wasn't easy. The PhD was probably the biggest hurdle that I've had to overcome. So it's now having piece of paper proves my determination, my resiliency. I was just talking to a colleague yesterday, actually, and she was talking about her husband's experience and how there are some programs who are deliberate in, academic hazing in a sense, and it's also much more challenging for those of us of color to be able to persist and not having the cultural capital to be able to rely on to get us through the process. So it's much more difficult in a lot of ways. And I think about her comments as she was saying that it was challenging for her husband because of that, and the program did make her husband's life hell. And I know what that looks like. And so that I've read 2 dissertation proposals just even this year of colleagues of mine. Just how can I help? What can I do? How can, what questions can I ask or help you answer, and how do you want to ask these research questions? Maybe think about this way. All of those things are essential to that piece of paper because that being my biggest accomplishment helps me to want other people to know what that feels like too.
So, as a Hispanic female with a PhD, which puts you in rarefied air,
Yes.
do you feel any responsibility or pressure because of that?
I feel a huge responsibility. And I don't think that responsibility and pressure, those are synonymous. I think that responsibility, that I do get back in a lot of different ways. And then I do serve in roles that showcase that less than 1% of what I've been able to attain. I serve as the national co-chair for the Latino knowledge community currently, and that is something that's also been just a great accomplishment. But it puts me in a position to be able to serve as a leader and hopefully inspire others to see that there are possibilities. So I take that responsibility. I try to be involved in my community. I try to give back to Oklahoma State. I support my Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers because those were my ICs, they're my babies. And I'll always want to give back to them because I know what the great work that they also do, a high school program to bring students on campus, and I've seen how effective it is. And so that responsibility comes from how I give on a personal level, how I give on a financial level, and how I give, to just being visible in a lot of ways.
So you mentioned the Society for Hispanic Professional Engineers.
Yes.
Which is the first time you've mentioned them.
Yes.
And you said they're your babies.
They're my babies.
So can you tell me more about that program?
So I actually, working in diversity, I got involved in helping a lot with the engineering because they seem to have funding available. and plus that's also like currently my job is in the STEMs field, and I know that's where we are very, very few in regards to Hispanics being visible and getting PhDs or getting their degrees. So when I got involved in engineering and also with they were doing these summer programs, and then there became more and more Hispanic students who we were outreaching to, and got involved with the Society of Hispanic Professional Engineer program there on campus. And that I started that probably in 2008. So my first summer program was there, helped stay the night. I mean, I was giving back and wanting to have I didn't know anything about engineering so much. That wasn't the field I was interested in or had a background in. And so it was more about the student support and helping them feel connected and that they could ask any questions, and meeting their parents. That was always something so fun. I still have so many stories of students how I met their parents, and these kind of programs. But those students that were in high school, so many of them came to the university, and I know that work that we did in regards to helping them feel like they were connected, and plus, coming on campus and seeing this amazing facilities and knowing that people cared, that is essential. And I still keep in contact with a lot of those students, and because of that piece of helping them to understand, and plus so important, especially with STEMs fields, to encourage that in high school. Yes, you need to take a science class while you're in high school. Just because you took it as a freshman when you were in 9th grade, you still need to take it continue those skills, because when they get to the university, they do awful, unfortunately, because they haven't had it for 4 years. You can't, if I were to go back right now and take a biology course, oh my God. So, you can only imagine what these young people, so those programs were able to say, hey, got to be proactive. Your advisor's might not tell you this, or your counselor's not going to tell you this, but you take a math, take a science as many times as you can throughout your high school experience to be better prepared for when you get to the university, especially when you do the STEMs. So all of those different aspects were essential in why I get back and why so many of the students made a difference to me.
So SHPE?
SHPE, SHIP.
SHIP. I guess the program was going on before you got involved with them?
Yes, I think so. I couldn't tell you like who the advisor was for them. I just remember some of the students, and it's been fascinating to see that being so important, because so many of them were high school students, to now be at the college to want to continue to do this high school program because it's what helped change their life too. And so that giving back, that cycle of, wanting to be and go back to your communities, that was also important. Going back to some of these schools that they went to when they were in Oklahoma City or Tulsa, that just to be able to be there and be visible to the students, the high school students as college students. I'm at Oklahoma State, and there's such a pride that goes with that. So yeah, I don't remember who at the beginning, but it was the students that made such an impression on me.
So it's a program that basically grows its own replacements.
Yes, it has. I can't tell you now. I still know several students, but the one student I was closest to graduated. So
now that we've talked about a lot of stuff in your past and present, what dreams or what visions do you have for yourself in the future?
I want to be a philanthropist. I want to be able to be in a position to continue to give back and be encouraging in different ways. I'd like to live in Mexico at some point. I don't know. I hope to continue down this path to do similar work or do work that I'm doing. I'd like to be in a position more advanced in the sense that helping to contribute to policies and procedures that way things are done. I continue to be progressive and involved to consider. I've seen a lot change, I think, in my personal experience, but things still continue to need to evolve, I think, and taking into consideration all the different aspects of our students.
So is there something that you'd like to say to future or current Hispanic students at OSU?
I met a lot of students who did their best to try to fit in. And I think that if I were to say something and helping students to understand that their story matters, that where you come from feeds you to where you end up. And that's a great asset to have. And, whether it be that you come from, that you are undocumented or your parents are undocumented or, not having the educational background that you would hope to be able to adequately persist at the university, that knowing that all of that matters and it's going to make you stronger. And I would never say that because I did it, you can, because I feel like that is language that is very ethnocentric. But I would say that once you get where you want to be, it'll all be worth it.
And is there anything that I didn't ask you about that you wanted to add to your story?
I would just say, you know, I've been at rival institutions, and I've been have had a variety of experiences, but you know, Oklahoma State is always where I'll call home. And you know, there is such an amazing community that I've been able to know in the 16 years that I was either going to school, well, most of those 16 years I was going to school, or have worked there. And you know, it always felt like home to me. That's important, and I think it's unfortunate that the university hasn't figured out ways to get better connected to our alum who are also Latino. But I hope that that is something that we can, via this project or via the work that some of you all are doing, that we can find better ways to make those connections, because it was a very isolating experience for me in a lot of ways, and I'm glad I had the students to be able to help to build that community, but it would be nice to be able to know others out there.
Thank you very much.